to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And today we're going to talk about one of the most controversial topics hitting the headlines, and that is artificial intelligence. With us today is an expert in artificial intelligence. He has a PhD, in fact, in the field. Dr. George Zarkadakis, author of an exciting new book. The book is called In Our Own Image, Savior or Destroyer, The History and Future of Artificial Intelligence. And we should also say once again that he has a PhD in the field of artificial intelligence, and, get this, he was awarded a knighthood by the French government for his international work in science communication. So once again, in this hour, we'll be talking about robots. Are they really a boom for humanity, or are they really going to be the destroyer of humanity? And at what point will machines become conscious? But in this hour, we're going to focus on one of the hottest topics hitting the press, and that is artificial intelligence. We're way beyond the point where we simply have toys that simply move like a human being. No, we're talking about the job market. We're talking about the nature of our society. What happens when robots enter our living room? What about society itself? And we have a debate between two billionaires. We have on one hand Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who says that artificial intelligence will give us a bounty of prosperity. New jobs, new industries, new opportunities with artificial intelligence. And then we have another billionaire, Elon Musk, who says, well, not so fast. You see, because one day the robots may turn on us, and that poses an existential threat to humanity itself. In other words, are we creating, in some sense, our evolutionary successors by creating robots? Well, we'll discuss all these things with our special guest, Dr. George Zarkadakis. Well, George, the first question that we always ask our guests is, how did you, as a youth, now as a kid, first get interested in science? What propelled you in that direction?
Of course, and thank you very much for inviting me on your show, Professor Kaku. So you see, I was sort of grew up during the Apollo program, space program. So, I was a young kid, completely fascinated with the fact that we could send people on the moon to land and walk around. So I thought that was absolutely amazing. And I believe that was the beginning of my sort of journey into science and indeed engineering. I wanted to become a space engineer initially. I wanted to be the one who would send people up in space and maybe, jump on one of the spaceships myself one day. So that's how my fascination with science began.
And what steered you in the direction of mathematics, computer science, and then to get a PhD in artificial intelligence?
Oh, absolutely. So I started my studies in the field of control engineering precisely because I was very keen to understand how spaceflight could be made possible. And I guess one thing led to another. I was introduced into artificial intelligence by several people at my university. It was like in the 80s, and there was a lot of debate around what would be the next step in AI and whether we should build systems based on the human cognition architecture, like how the human brain works, or whether we should build another kind of system. I thought that debate was brilliant, and I was also interested to understand the human mind. So I thought, hey, what a great way to understand the human mind through engineering, and that's artificial intelligence. So that's how I sort of led gradually into AI. I did several projects at university, sort of building my first systems, and then decided to, continue with a PhD.
Okay, well, your book, In Our Own Image, differs from other books in artificial intelligence because, first of all, it starts with the history, the ancient history, the history going back all the way to the Greeks, where we have myths, we have mythologies about robots, and perhaps every society has some myth or other of our interactions with things which are mechanical and come to life. For example, Pygmalion, which eventually became the Broadway musical My Fair Lady. is about the whole idea of a statue coming to life. And we have the mythology of Pandora. Pandora, in one version of the myth, was actually a robot created by Vulcan. So explain to us, and also explain why it's so embedded in our ancient mythology, the whole idea of artificial life.
Absolutely. So in my book, I try to trace this idea, this quite curious idea of human beings creating artifacts with minds, artifacts that look like them, artifacts with whom they have conversations and, in fact, build relationships as well. So I thought that's a curious idea. Where does that thing come from? And as I was looking into the past, I saw great similarities between this idea and how we create art in general, how we create, let's say, an image of something. And when we observe this image, we automatically project our own minds into what we see. For example, when we see the portrait of a person, or when we see a statue, or indeed when we see a play, how we, separate ourselves from reality, and we imagine that the people on stage actually are who they pretend to be. So that's a very curious, if you like, aspect of the human cognitive system that has a name. It's called theory of mind. It's what we do as we grow beyond the age of 3 years old, in fact, and when we understand that other people have minds as well. So this sort of cognitive, if you like, aspect of our intelligence is what kicked in several thousand years ago when we started creating art. And automatically, if you like, spontaneously, we started, creating images of ourselves. First with statues, and as mythology progressed, we started imagining those statues coming alive. We imagined gods creating artificial beings like Hephaestus, the god of, or Vulcan as he's called in Latin, creating iron maidens that helped him in Olympus to create his wonderful inventions, and so on and so forth. So there's a long history, both in ancient Greece and other cultures, as you mentioned, of humans and gods creating artificial beings. And then these stories sort of, were reshaped down the line, let's say in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, by the Romantic writers, and in more modern times into films, like, all the films we love.
Okay, George, we're going to have to take a short commercial break. Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Today our special guest is Dr. George Zarkadakis, author of a new book about robots. How dangerous are they? Are they going to give us a new wave of prosperity and jobs, or will they spell our doom? Now, George, in your book, you go one step farther than other people who talk about the history of artificial intelligence, where many societies have mythologies about creating a golem or a mechanical Pandora. You say that it is genetically hardwired into our brains, that we are in some sense compelled to do this. So how do you argue the fact that our desire to create artificial life is in some sense genetically hardwired into our brain?
So this has to do, I guess, with our evolution. It is very important that we have this cognitive function in order to be able to relate with each other. So all the things that we have with regards to social consciousness, with regards to empathy, with regards to feeling for one another comes from this very fundamental part of a human brain. And indeed, it's this precise sort of faculty, if you like, of the mind that makes us project our own minds into the modern facets of artificial intelligence. Like, for instance, when you speak to a digital assistant, certainly that digital assistant is very well made. You think that there might be a human being behind it. It's that sort of relationship that plays with our brain and with our minds every time we interact with an artificial intelligence system.
Okay, let's talk about the movies now, because you have a whole section about the movies. One of the first silent movies ever made was called Metropolis. It is a science fiction movie about creating a woman robot. In fact, a very attractive woman robot that then goes to mislead the masses of workers to create a revolution against the working class. It's an incredible movie, far ahead of its time. So do you think, therefore, that in science fiction and the movies, we basically convey our hopes, dreams, and fears of artificial intelligence?
Most certainly, absolutely. I think this movie was also a product of its times, a product of a time in human civilization where there was, in many ways, many similarities than today. People were seeing the mechanization of work in a massive way. Big factories were being built in North America and in Europe. Assembly lines were put in place. Workers would find themselves, being part of a machine system rather than, the previous sort of ways that we had to produce value, which were more humane, if you like, more social. So all this, if you like, dehumanization of human work was quite shocking and led to all kinds of ideas about the future, including what will happen if, humans would be subjects of more powerful robots. So you see, this idea that we are discussing today in the 21st century was an idea very much that was born out of the previous industrial revolution, where the assembly line became the core, the most basic way that we start producing our goods in the Western world.
Okay, now you also go to the movie Blade Runner, a classic movie, where there is an ambiguity between who is human and who is not human. And when you leave the movie theater after watching Harrison Ford on the silver screen, you begin to wonder, is Harrison Ford also a robot? So explain to us the ambiguities in the movie Blade Runner.
Absolutely. So Blade Runner was based on a short story by the author Philip Dick. And Philip Dick's work is all about this ambiguity. So he imagined a future where we have developed a technology that creates human-like androids of such amazing similarity that we can't tell the difference. And the obvious conclusion from that hypothetical world is, of course, paranoia. So in a world that you are unable to distinguish between who's a human and who's not, the end result is paranoia. And in fact, this paranoia turns back to you as well. For instance, how do you know that you're a human? And that's one aspect of Blade Runner, I think, that's been rarely discussed, because the Blade Runner himself is not sure at the end if he's one of the androids that he's, hunting down.
Okay, now then the question is, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing? If you take a look at The Wizard of Oz, we had the Tin Man. And the Tin Man was benevolent, and all the Tin Man wanted to do was to become human and have a heart. Then we have Data from Star Trek, The Next Generation. Data has superhuman intelligence, but what does he want? He wants to have emotions. He wants to be like a human. So, on the other hand, we have the Terminator, where Arnold Schwarzenegger has no intention of becoming a human. All he sees when he sees a human is a victim. So what are your thoughts now about what happens when computers become much more intelligent and more human-like?
So I think those examples that you've just given show the tension, if you like, between two different narratives that we have around AI and around robots. One is a very positive narrative. You mentioned the movies. I can think of AI as well by Spielberg, and the original Pinocchio story as well. The artifact wanted to become human, to become like human. And then you have this very negative, this very dark story where, we create an artifact, and this is a hubris. This is something that we should not be doing. We are challenging the gods, if you like, and that turns against us. And you can trace that dark narrative even in Frankenstein, the story of Frankenstein. So we have those two different angles, if you like, by which we're trying to interpret both our emotions and views, and also get a glimpse of the future. So I think, if we do away with the narratives and try to be more rational and more clear about what AI will become in the future, then I'm very much of an optimist. I think, I guess I'm an engineer, that's why I'm an optimist, but I think it is up to us to shape AI so that it becomes the good AI rather than the bad AI. So it's how we design it, how we build it, and how we adopted that are keys to developing the kind of technology that would be beneficial to humankind rather than the opposite.
Okay, now let's talk about the reality. We talked about Hollywood, and there's a movie, 2001, which features the robot HAL, which was supposed to be as realistic as you can possibly imagine for the year 2001. The movie came out around 1968, and some people say that Arthur C. Clarke, he was way off. We are far, far from being able to create a robot called HAL that can pilot a spaceship all the way out to Jupiter, that can talk like an ordinary human being and even masquerade as a human being if he felt like. So the question is, how are we today? Our robots, some people say, have the intelligence of a cockroach. So should we be worried about them when robots have the intelligence of a bug? And the robot HAL is still many, many decades into the future. What's the state of robotics today?
Okay, so I think it's not really helping very much if we project evolutionary terms onto robotic sort of development, because it's completely different. So robots do not sort of self-develop. So let me try to respond to the question that you put across. So we see, because of a technique in artificial intelligence called deep learning, some amazing advances in the field. We see, for example, machines being able to recognize faces, to recognize human faces or recognize images, understand human language, being able to respond. We also see systems like, for example, AlphaGo, being able to beat humans in a very, very complex game called Go, which is very, very popular, as you know, in the Far East. So we see there's amazing advances. However, there are certain limitations. There really are some amazing limitations. So despite the hype around AI, there's some very big problems that AI has not solved yet. And I'll just mention two that I think are very, very important. One is common sense, and the other one is, I guess, self-awareness or consciousness. So unless we find a way to solve for those two problems, and they are huge problems, I don't believe that we're even close to having, to worry about whether AI will, turn against us and destroy us.
Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, in this hour, we're talking about, one of the hottest topics hitting the business section of the newspaper. We're talking about robots and jobs, and will one day a robot take your job? Well, George, let's say we take away all the hype, all the Hollywood imagery of Terminator robots, and look at the actual state of the art today. Isn't it true, for example, that a robot would have a hard time picking up garbage? Every piece of garbage is different, non-repetitive at all. You have to distinguish between good garbage and bad garbage. So sanitation men, some people feel, will have jobs for many a year into the future, or police. You have to go into the mind of a criminal. Robots can't do that, right? Or fixing a toilet. Every toilet is different. Every break is different. And a carpenter, a construction worker. These are non-repetitive, semi-skilled jobs. And the question is, are they relatively safe from robots replacing their job anytime soon?
So I think the way to start thinking about this problem is, instead of thinking in terms of jobs, to start thinking in terms of tasks. Instead of thinking about the whole job, let's say the janitor, think about what does a janitor do, for example, or think what the doctor is actually doing, and breaking down with tasks. Because what we see and what is happening already is that intelligent systems like artificial intelligence and sometimes robotics replace and automate some tasks within a job, but not the whole job. So to your point, it's very unlikely or even desirable that one wants to build a complex robot to completely replace a human being doing a complex job. What is likely to happen, and what has been happening in fact for many decades with information technology, is the digitalization of many, many tasks. That is, the transformation of physical tasks that we do into lines of code that run on server farms. So we see that happening, and there's a lot of incentive for something like that happening. you can increase productivity, you can have more efficient processes, and so on and so forth. So to your point about what's going to happen to our jobs, there's a lot of research right now. The research that we do in the companies that I work for points to the fact that the most likely scenario would be the augmentation of human creativity. That means that human beings and intelligent machines working side by side for the best possible outcomes rather than machines completely replacing humans. So this is probably the most likely scenario, at least for the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years, given the rate that technology is advancing.
Well, in Asia, for example, they have robots that can replace waiters, robots that can cook. In fact, they can make noodles in 1 minute and 29 seconds. Robots that can become like receptionists as they greet you when you check into a hotel. So some people say that jobs that are semi-repetitive, that require the same task over and over and over again, those jobs really could be replaced in the future. Take a look at Amazon. Amazon is already looking at the retailer and looking at the question of whether or not you can replace the person that you talk to when you walk into a store and ask simple questions. So what are your recommendations? If somebody comes up to you and says, what kinds of jobs should I train for in the future? Would you say jobs that involve the mind, creativity, jobs that involve higher education? What advice would you give to a young person?
So to that question, I can only answer that, most of the professions that exist today did not exist, let's say, 10 years ago. So the economy is creating completely new jobs as technology is kicking in, as businesses change, as everything changes. So the only way you can hedge your future, in fact, is being able to unlearn and learn as quickly as you can. All of us, and certainly, younger people, will probably change many, many careers in their lives. They have to, if you like, pivot their careers again and again, every now and then. So being able to learn new skills and upskill yourself very quickly, it would be essential. Now, having said that, what we see clearly is that what businesses require more and more are people that are able to combine, if you like, different types of knowledge and different types of skills and competencies. Like, for instance, you really need to have a good grounding on STEM subjects. There's no question about that. Absolutely. You need to understand science, technology, engineering, and maths. But at the same time, it helps a lot if you understand, if you have a good grasp of the English language, if you know history and sociology, if you have a good grasp of the humanities as well, and you can bring that knowledge to bear into solving complex business problems. So I think that polymath that can unlearn and learn would be the successful professional of the future, if I can put it in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, I once had a conversation with a stockbroker who said that he's a middleman, and of course, robots can replace middlemen, especially a broker. However, even though you can buy stocks on your wristwatch today and don't even need a stockbroker, people come up to him because they want something that robots cannot provide. They want experience, know-how, savvy. They want the gossip. They want the experience of somebody who's been trading stocks for many, many years. They want innovation. They want leadership. And this intellectual skill is very difficult for robots. And he says that's what he sells. He no longer really sells stocks, because you can buy that on your wristwatch. Mm-hmm. You want advice, learned advice. Intellectual capital is what he sells. So what are your thoughts about middlemen who try to no longer sell what they usually sell, like airplane tickets, but instead sell intellectual capital? That is advice, experience, know-how, savvy, the rumors of what's happening on the market, things that robots cannot do at all. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. You're so right. And your friend actually has diagnosed, the future very, very, very well indeed, because that's exactly what's happening. And it's, in my opinion, a good thing. Essentially what those systems do is they take away all those tasks that are, in fact, very low-level tasks. That's why they're being automated. And that's a good thing, because that means that, people of experience can leverage that experience to do more valuable and high-level tasks, like, to your point, advise people about the correct strategy for their investment, sit down with them and understand more about, their appetite for risk, for example, make sure that they are successful in their investments in that particular example. So I think that's where the opportunity really is. AI, artificial intelligence, can be a cognitive multiplier for human creativity and productivity, and that's how businesses are already trying to shape the jobs of the future. That's where they see the opportunity in leveraging technology in order to have better business outcomes. And that's why there will be such a massive impact on work as well. But in my opinion, it will be mostly positive. It's not going to be all positive, definitely not, but it will be mostly positive, and it will require from, I guess, most of us to continuously retrain and reskill in the next few years.
Well, let me ask you the key question. Some people say that robots will never approach human intelligence. In fact, there's a physicist, Roger Penrose, a colleague of mine, who says that the brain is quantum mechanical and therefore can never be approximated by transistors and traditional robot digital technology. Then we have other people who've been on the show, Ray Kurzweil, another acquaintance of mine, who says, robots are not only going to surpass us, one day they may even take over. They'll have children that are smarter than they, and they will proliferate ever-increasing intelligence with each generation until they take over the entire Earth. In fact, maybe the Earth will one day become a robot. Well, what are your thoughts? Is it possible to build a mechanical man and a mechanical woman? If so, can we create one that's even smarter than the previous generation? What are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are that this is a question that is absolutely impossible to answer right now. And I'm afraid that I have to give you a more nuanced answer than all your previous interviewees. And the reason why I'm giving this answer is because obviously there's a lot of debate around this subject, and should be, and this is a very important question to ask with all kinds of technology. I mean, think back, of nuclear energy. Here's a technology that can destroy us, of course. And now we have artificial intelligence. Now the problem with that particular question is that we don't really understand what human intelligence is. I mean, we have some ideas, I guess, from neurobiology, from psychology, but when it comes to engineering, we have no idea whatsoever. And for instance, MIT is setting up an intelligent quest to understand human intelligence in engineering terms, because this is a huge gap. So when you speak about artificial intelligence, sort of reaching human-level intelligence, I would submit that this sentence in itself does not make sense right now for any engineer. What we have managed to achieve with technology is create systems that can solve for very narrow problems, like what I mentioned before about recognizing faces, maybe understand human language. That kind of problems we can solve. But when you think about, simple tasks that a little baby can do, like a little toddler can do, for instance, understand the world without anyone explaining the world to them, being able to solve problems completely using first principles, then we're talking about a completely different kind of intelligence that we have yet to understand, even if that intelligence is ours. So unless we can unpack human intelligence, unless we can break it down, if ever such thing is possible, then I'm afraid this question will remain unanswered.
Okay. Well, let me give you my spin on the whole subject, and then, you can take it anywhere you want. My own personal opinion is that robots today have the intelligence of a cockroach. They can barely navigate in a room. They can't hide, find mates, find food, find shelter. Even a cockroach can do that. You put a robot in the forest, and the robot simply gets lost. However, it's only a matter of time before robots become as smart as a mouse, and then as a rat, smart as a rabbit, cat, dog, and maybe by the end of the century as smart as a monkey. At that point, they could be potentially dangerous, because monkeys do have a well-defined sense of self-awareness. Monkeys have their own agenda. They have their own point of view. They know they're not humans. At that point, I think that when robots have self-awareness, that is, the self-awareness of a monkey, we should put a chip in their brain to shut them off. Because they could have murderous thoughts. They have self-awareness. They could have goals completely different from our goals. They could create their own goals, in fact. And so we should put a fail-safe system in them to shut them off. Now, then the next question is what happens in the next century when robots can remove their own fail-safe system? they can remove all the chips that would shut them off if they have murderous thoughts. What happens then? Well, this is science fiction, of course. At this point, I think we should merge with them. Instead of fighting them, why not merge with them and become superhuman? Why not use all the capabilities of cybernetics and biotechnology to create superhumans? But anyway, that's my thinking. So what are your thoughts? Because you've obviously thought about this. You've seen all the science fiction movies. What are your thoughts?
So I think on principle, I don't think that, theoretically speaking, if nature has managed to evolve things called brains that are conscious and intelligent, then I don't see any reason why we cannot sort of engineer something like that, something that has a mind and perhaps something that is self-aware. So I don't know how we're going to do it. As I said before, I have no idea, and I don't think anyone does. But let's think of that. I think theoretically it is possible. Now, if that is possible and we do create such machines, then all the dangers that you've just described, Professor Kaku, are real. There's no question about that. Especially if such a machine has access to computer infrastructure and data and information that no single human or, all of us together could possibly be able to have access and process. So I think that's the tipping point where technology that we create becomes extremely dangerous. And I can think of other technologies as well, like, for instance, genetic engineering. So therefore, I think we must have mechanisms to control the development of artificial intelligence so we don't reach that point, so we don't play with fire, so we don't set off, a sequence of events that could potentially lead to our extinction.
Okay, well, we began the show by pointing out that we had this dichotomy between Zuckerberg and Musk. Robots are dangerous, says Musk, or robots are a helper, says Zuckerberg. My own opinion is it's a matter of time. In the short term, I think Zuckerberg is right. In the long term, let's not be naive, they could become dangerous. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Once again, our special guest was George Zarkadakis. The book is called In Our Own Image. I highly recommend it. So once again, thank you, George, for being on Science Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.